So I'd like to, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today. Kaci Buhl is an associate professor here at OSU. She coordinates the statewide pesticide safety education program. Kaci is also the deputy director of a National Pesticide Educational Resources Collaborative, which creates pesticide training manuals, exams, and other resources for professionals. She studied IPM at Michigan State University and previously coordinated the National Pesticide Information Center, NPIC, which you may be familiar with from your training. So thank you for presenting today, Kaci, and I'll let you take it away. I'm going to be kind of popping in to moderate as needed, and thank you.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you, Brooke. Let me share my screen here. We have so much to cover in an hour, so I'm just going to start plowing ahead. I'm very grateful for everyone who showed up. Thank you for your time. And I'm also aware that lots of people are going to be watching this on the internet later, so I'm going to speak to some of those individuals as well. And I put in 4 places throughout this presentation for questions. So please jot them down as they occur to you, and we'll have a conversation. I don't plan to talk the whole time. I'd like to hear from you as well. So as with any Oregon State University presentation, I have to remind you that as an applicator, it's your responsibility to take responsibility for any pesticide application, whether it's organic, low risk, any kind of pesticide. And if I mention trade names, and I'm going to mention some trade names, it's not necessarily a recommendation. It's just for illustration purposes only. And before we talk about using pesticides, I have to give some love to IPM. It's where I come from, and it's what all of you guys have been trained in as well. Identify your pest. Really, you have to know your enemy in order to do the best job. When I say do some science, I mean monitor, set some traps, track them back to their nests, figure out what's going on with those pests before you make a decision on how to manage them. Think about how many pests you can tolerate. I know you've been introduced to this topic before, but ask yourself, can you afford to lose one vegetable crop out of your whole garden every year? Would that be so bad? Because those aphids that are just chewing up your kale are feeding your natural enemies. So, think about how much you can tolerate. Prevention is key, and combine your methods. Biological, physical, mechanical, psychological warfare, what have you. All of it belongs in there. All right, and again, before you spray, let's think very quickly about what that does to the ecosystem in your garden. So let's say, for example, you have this leaf here starting out, and you have too many pests, a couple of predators. When you spray, you might kill most of the predators, most of the pests, but there might still be a couple of pests hanging out. But the predators that are left in this scenario are likely to starve because there's not enough pests there for them to eat. So then you have a resurgence that can be worse than what you started out with in the first place. And in a more realistic scenario, more complex system, you might have lots of different pests and lots of different predators. Let's say the red pests are eaten by the green predators, is just for example, and the orange is eaten by the blue. You have this mix, this complex set of things in your garden. When you spray, again, you get all those predators and most of the predators and most of the pests. The predators have a hard time coming back because there's not enough food. You can actually have a secondary pest outbreak that is not the thing you were spraying for. You might have been spraying for this orange pest, and then you have a resurgence of the red pest. So before you decide to spray, take a good look at the ecology in your garden. And remember, we're going for this. We're going for a really complex, diverse, buffered system against outbreaks. All right, moving forward, we're here to talk about pesticides, organic pesticides. Just going to give that a second. This is an advanced training for master gardeners, so I'm sure many of you in the audience know that there is such a thing as organic pesticides. Some people might have clicked on this on the internet just thinking, are you trying to break organic? Like, are you trying to blow my mind? Well, organic pesticides are definitely a thing, and they exist, and we're going to talk about which ones they are. So let's clarify this with a poll question to get you guys interacting. Mark, this is the first question that they'll choose one of these. When we say organic pesticides, we're generally talking about pesticides with carbon in their chemical structures for the chemistry buffs in the group. Pesticides that were discovered accidentally, like they just kind of came up organically. Pesticides that come from natural sources in general, or none of the above. There's no such thing as organic pesticides.
Okay, I've got the poll up now, so go ahead and vote, folks. I see if a few of you are already starting the vote. We'll just take 20 seconds, 30 seconds maybe.
Okay.
Okay, we got about half of the folks. We'll take another 10 seconds.
Okay.
Still coming in. Another 5 seconds. All right, I think that's good. We'll end the poll. And Brooke, if you want to sort of read those off. Share, sorry. Now you can read those off.
It looks like at 83%, pesticides that come from natural sources.
Fantastic. There were some answers that were smattered about through the other ones. Okay, just a couple. All right, well, good. See, we're learning something already. That's fantastic. When we talk about organic pesticides, we're typically talking about ones that come from natural sources. So let's dig into that just a little bit. Now, this is all defined by the National Organic Program of the USDA, and the idea in general was natural things, not synthetic things, but there are some exceptions. So some of the natural substances you see on this slide are not allowed. Even though they're natural, they're not allowed in organic systems. And likewise, all those synthetic things are generally banned, synthetic meaning man-made, but not all of them. Some man-made things have been approved. Now, this is pretty much the list of exceptions, but in general, the National Organic Program allows things that are of natural origin, and those might be things that come from plants, from animals, or are ground up from rocks that we mine. So those are all considered to be natural substances. So some of these things can be found in organic systems. Organic pesticides may contain carbon or not. So those of you who are chemistry inclined probably answered the question in this fashion. These are all organic pesticides on this list, and this is part of the way we're going to go over the wide variety of things. You'll see them listed on several of the slides throughout. Some things contain carbon, like the ones over here, and there are some that don't contain carbon. There are more things that are mined or found or that didn't come from a living entity. While we're talking about chemistry, I need to remind folks that chemistry is everywhere. I love this image from the most recent Scientific American that is a frozen rose that's shattered, and really the process that they use to make rose oil looks like this. It looks like a chemistry set, and it very much is. The process can involve a solvent extraction or supercritical carbon dioxide extraction, but chemistry is everywhere. And as educators, Master gardeners are educators, you can help. Don't fuel chemical phobias. Don't give the false impression that natural products are chemical free. It's not true, and it's not helpful. So when that comes across your desk and someone asks for something chemical free, take that opportunity, the learning moment, to remind them that chemicals are everywhere. And it's really the dose that makes the poison. Nothing is without poison. Apples, morning dew, butterflies, all of it. And literally, if you drink enough water, it can kill you. So this is the grounding force behind modern toxicology, is the idea that the dose makes the poison. Some things can behave differently at lower doses. Some things are still harmful at low doses. But in general, it's the dose. For example, mint, completely natural, not safe. It can be highly toxic to the eyes. The safety data sheet actually requires goggles to handle mint oil. Sulfur, also completely natural, not safe. It can cause significant health effects when it combines with other materials that can actually cause explosions. It can react with organic materials to produce hydrogen sulfide, which is highly flammable, corrosive, and potentially fatal if inhaled. And just one more example, copper sulfate is a very popular organic pesticide, but we hear about it every summer. A couple of times, we've already heard about it once this summer, where copper sulfate being misused in a pond to control algae can kill all the fish in that pond if it's not done correctly and the label directions are not followed. Completely natural, not safe, botulism, snake venom, mercury, tigers. Okay, now that I've nailed that point home, what questions do you have before we move on?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A box yet.
Okay. Well, let's go to a poll question, and if someone's still typing their question, we'll still take it after the poll. So here's our next poll question. I prefer organic pesticides because And you can go ahead and start answering anytime. I feel better about sharing my produce. And this one is one that you can choose all that apply. So check the box for every one of these that is part of your decision making on whether or not you prefer organic pesticides. I guess I should have had a box that was, I don't prefer organic pesticides, but I figure if you showed up for this webinar, you probably do.
Okay, yeah, keep going, folks, and sort of when I see things slow down, we'll take another 20 seconds or so.
Okay.
Another 10 seconds.
And remember, if you have a question you want to pop into the question box, let's have a back and forth if we like. And Brooke's watching that for me. I can't see it, but she can.
Okay, so I'll end that poll and I'm going to share the results now.
Okay, I can actually see it, Mark.
Can you? Okay.
I can. All right.
Pretty evenly distributed.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of really positive thoughts there. Just a couple people mentioning I don't have to be as careful. The next slide is for you. So the label is the law, even for organic pesticides. I think there is sort of a mental shortcut that we like to take if it's something as a soft material or considered organic or minimum risk, that we don't have to be as careful. This is an example of a product that can be used in organic systems, but let's take a look at that label carefully. The product is toxic to aquatic invertebrates, toxic to certain non-targets, toxic to bees, don't apply directly to water, and this statement still appears on registered pesticide products. It's a violation of federal law to apply this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling, and as the applicator, that violation of federal law comes on you. Another statement, just to be careful, buyer beware. There is no federal or state definition to my knowledge of the term natural. You can put that on a label, no one's checking. No, there is no definition. So I could put that on my car and it's not illegal. It's just undefined. So these are the logos that we should be looking for. This is the logo on the left that you would see on produce that you purchase at the store. The other logo is the product that the logo that you would see on products you can use in organic systems. Now, this stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute, and it happens to be located right here in Oregon, in Eugene. I'm not aware of another organization that does what they do. They actually publish a list of all the materials that they approve for use. So it's pretty neat, and I'll show their website a little bit later. Other ways to look at this, and this is, bear with me for a minute, it's all going to come together in a moment. Many organic pesticides are biopesticides according to EPA, that's what they call them, and they have three groups of biopesticides: the biochemical ones, such as the plant extracts and hormones; microbial pesticides that actually have a microorganism, a virus or a bacterium or a fungus; and then plant incorporated protectants such as BT crops. I should clarify, those are not organic, but they are considered biopesticides by the EPA. And these benefits actually apply to a lot of the organic pesticide products that we're going to talk about today. They're usually less toxic, more pest specific, so they're less likely to affect non-targets, effective in smaller quantities, and often decompose faster. There's also another designation from EPA, and I need to mention this one because these are products that don't have to be registered with EPA. That means anybody in their garage can cook up a concoction, and as long as it meets these criteria, they can slap a label on it and put it in the marketplace with no review. Nobody's looking to see if it should have goggles for that level of toxicity to the eye, none of those things. So when you look at a pesticide product in the store, I want to mention that you're absolutely allowed to peel back. Sometimes the product has a label that's sealed under plastic. You're allowed to peel that back and read the label before you buy the product. And you probably should, to make sure that it's labeled for the types of uses that you want to see. But sometimes when you look at that label, you won't see environmental hazards or some of the classic things on the label that hopefully you're checking every time. And that's because they're not required to be registered. So between these three different types of designations, they're all trying to get at the same idea, the same mental shortcut that we like to take, that natural things are safer things. The minimum risk pesticides don't have to be registered. Biopesticides are defined differently. These are some things that actually show up in all three categories: salt, corn gluten meal, egg solids, clove oil, some of the other essential oils, hit the mark right in the middle between all of those. A couple examples of things that are biopesticides and organic, but they're not on the minimum risk list, which is really hard to change. They basically said they're not going to change that list. It is what it is. Pheromones, copper sulfate, sulfur, kaolin clay. If you want to protect your small fruits from flies, check that one out. It's pretty interesting. Hydrogen peroxide, BT, very popular spray for caterpillars and that sort of thing. Neem, capsaicin, and vinegar. We'll talk more about vinegar a little while. Some of the things that only fall into one category are listed here. They're all trying to get at the same basic idea, but when you ask, or when someone asks you as a master gardener for an organic recommendation, there's a whole suite of things. That might be their mental shortcut to ask about other ideas. If they're not a certified organization that has to, wants to sell their produce under the organic logo, then they might be interested in some of these other technologies as well. All right, now we're going to move on to looking for specific products for a specific pest. Gross. This is aphids on cabbage. So let's say you had aphids on cabbage and you wanted to find an organic pesticide to treat that problem. Now, this webinar will be shown all over the country, so I put up this map for those of you who are around the country. And if you were to go to this web page, and go to this URL that you see here, you can click on your state, and when you do, it'll bring up this list of contact information for the agency that regulates pesticides in your state, and right at the bottom, there's a spot where you can search for pesticide products that are registered in your state. That's great. That being said, if you were to click on Oregon or Washington, I think our pesticide search is better than your pesticide search, because it really is neat, and it allows you to search by whether or not something is OMRI certified by the Organic Materials Review Institute. So let's go through an example. In this example, I unclicked Washington and I clicked Oregon, and just to get started, said OMRI. You can item to search on, OMRI, yes. And when I hit submit query, I got 360 matching labels. Now, let's take that a bit further, and you can say refine query and add another criteria, and intended users, home. Submit query. Don't hit new query because that'll erase everything you've already done. So hit submit query and you'll have 159 matching labels. The next step, let's say the crop equals cabbage, and submit the query. You see how it's adding up all those queries that we've done before, so you're getting it keeps getting drilled down further and further. Cabbage, we have 70 matching labels. And then submit query with pest and aphid, and we have 30 matching labels, matching products. So that's a manageable amount of products to take a look at and try to make a decision about what you'd like to use in your situation. Now, when you're happy with it and you've got those 30 matching labels, you hit a button called Format Labels. Then we're going to see this screen that helps you put together what your output is going to look like. It's very customizable. When I do searches for specific products, I often click all just so I can see everything the database has about that product. But in this case, let's keep it simple. I want to see the product name. I put that in there, ingredient, and the formulation. And then view labels. And you actually get a report just like we asked for, product name, ingredient, formulation. You can export these results to Excel, super cool, sort it in different ways. It's a really handy thing, especially for master gardeners when you want to see the breadth of things that are available for callers that reach out to you for help. So based on that list, I looked at all the active ingredients and kind of grouped them up in this slide. So for organic product registered for use in Oregon this year, intended users, home, cabbage, aphids, 6 criteria. And these are the active ingredients that came up several times. Now, these items that you see in that left-hand column are all plant extracts. Azadirachtin comes from neem oil, so I did list them separately because neem oil has a lot of other stuff besides azadirachtin, but azadirachtin is its most active component. Many of those things act by repelling pests, by serving as a feeding deterrent, and they tend to work differently on different insects. Every other year, I go to the National Conference on Urban Entomology, and I've heard a lot of presentations about the effectiveness of essential oils. And the big take-home message is it depends on the pest and it depends on the oil. We've seen research where, for example, like peppermint oil works really well on German cockroaches, but not American cockroaches. And clove oil works great on some ants, but not other ants. So essential oils are a very diverse bunch, just like the pests in our garden, so they can have different levels of effectiveness. Potassium laurate is basically a soap salt, and that's going to work on aphids in a similar way to the mineral oil by clogging up their spiracles, their breathing tubes. Soap can do that, oils can do that. Spinosad kind of sits by itself in its own little category. It comes from soil bacteria. It's relatively new on the market. And if you have pests in your garden that are resistant to some of your favorite pesticides, spinosad might be something new to expose that population to. And I put pyrethrins off to the side, not with the other plant extracts, because pyrethrins actually act on the nervous system. So if you ask EPA, that kind of makes them not a biopesticide. It's still organic, but it's acting on the nervous system, just like an organophosphate or a carbamate might. They hit different parts of the chemical the system, but they all work on the nervous system. Now, let's take a moment for neem oil. It's such a big deal in organic systems. I wanted to pay some special attention. Azadirachtin is the most active component. So when you're comparing pesticides and you're comparing neem and azadirachtin, they basically have the same kind of stuff in them. Neem oil will have some other components that also seem to have an effect on deterring pests from feeding on your plants, but it's not very well understood. So azadirachtin is most commonly distilled. It reduces feeding by insects and nematodes, very cool, and it acts as a repellent and deters, it also interferes with insect hormones. Neem oil can be slightly irritating to the eyes and skin. Bees and other pollinators are not likely to be harmed by neem because they typically have to eat it to be affected by it, and the pollinators are not eating that treated foliage. They might be gathering stuff nearby, but not eating that treated foliage. You might notice I put a URL toward the bottom of this slide, and this information comes from the NPIC fact sheet on neem, and they're a great set of fact sheets to use to answer questions when you're responding to questions from the public. If you haven't visited these, I encourage you to check them out. Back to the list of results for cabbage aphid. I looked into that list and found several of those products that actually have a signal word of warning, which indicates moderate toxicity. Signal word of caution means low toxicity. Signal word of danger means high. So do be aware that even with plant oils, essential oils, there can be some significant dangers on the label to be aware of. And this one, the case of wearing protective eyewear and gloves. That's why you want to look at the label before you buy the product, because you might have to also pick up some gloves and eyewear while you're at the store. It could be toxic to bees, and it is a combustible liquid. So I'm just really belaboring the point that we need to read the label no matter how light we think the pesticide might be. There is another way for folks in other states, especially, to search for pesticides that are allowed for different purposes in organic production. This one doesn't allow you to search by crop or pest, but it's about 192 pages long. If you were to download that, the whole list, Complete Company NOP, that's the whole list right there, 192 pages, and they update it every, I think it said twice a month. So they're constantly making determinations and updating that information, and there is a cool search feature as well. So those can be tools that you might use on the phone with callers. All right, in the next section, I'm going to talk about some fungicides and rodenticides, that kind of stuff. But first, I want to pause for any questions that you might have about searching for organic products, some of the insecticide topics we talked about.
Yeah, I put a couple of links. I'm not sure if I got that right, Brooke. You may want to sanity check that. But when you're on the search page, I didn't really see the URL, so I think I found it and put a link in chat for that. Brooke put a couple of links in chat, so you've got that. And also, while we're on it, while I'm here, a few people ask about the slides, and we'll make the slides available at learn.extension.org after the webinar.
That's great.
Kaci, there's one question that just came in the Q&A, and they want just a quick reminder on the difference between a biopesticide and an organic pesticide.
Sure. Biopesticide is defined by the US EPA, and they kind of made up what they consider a biopesticide or not. It has it either is a microbial product that actually has a microorganism as its active ingredient, or It is a something of natural origin that acts by a non-toxic mode of action. That's problematic. It's hard for me to explain. I'm sure it's going to be hard for you to explain, but the difference would be a non-toxic mode of action might be something that attracts a wasp to a trap. If it attracts things or it repels things, or some of the desiccating powders are not really getting into the body but acting outside the body of the insect, they consider those to be biopesticides, whereas the ones that actually get in and have a toxic mode of action, they don't consider to be biopesticides, but they might still be organic if they're of natural origin.
A couple more questions that came in, and you might get to these too. These two kind of go together. So one question is asking, how do they know what's most effective? And then the second question is asking about using the PNW handbooks that we have. And so maybe you're going to get to that.
Okay, I'll take one at a time.
Okay.
What's most effective? I wasn't going to talk about that, but I should have brought that up. How do we know what's most effective? Trial and error. It's going to have to be on a local level because pests and pest populations everything is local. Your neighbor might use something that works in their situation that doesn't work in your situation, even if just the microclimate is different, if it's warmer over there or cooler in your area. So it's just so wildly diverse. No one's checking, not OMRI, not EPA, no one is checking for efficacy. So I could put a bottle of water out there and claim that it kills some pest. It's not illegal to make absolutely false claims, because they can't be verified, really, because things are so different in different places around the country. Master gardeners, I recommend talking to someone local. When calls come into the National Pesticide Information Center and they're asking what's effective, we refer them to you guys, like what's working for you and your neighbors. That's more likely to be accurate than something that we could refer to here. There are some peer-reviewed studies out there for efficacy. They trickle out from entomology journals quite often, but there's more research going on for conventional pesticides than organic pesticides. So it's harder to find that data. And the other question had to do with the PNW handbooks. I'm sorry, I don't know if they actually cover which ones are organically certified and which ones are not. Typically, I think the PNW handbooks talk about active ingredients, like I have been today, but products have to be evaluated on a formulation basis. So I could take an organic active ingredient and put it with some kind of really heavy and duty industrial solvent, and then it's not an organic product anymore, right? So it has to be product by product. I don't think the PNW handbooks do product by product very often. They stick with active ingredients, but maybe you can tell me if it's a great resource that I should have mentioned.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah.
Is this a good time? Okay. So one, I think, comes back to when you were talking about neem oil, and they want to know why the neem oil products are not marked OMRI.
Oh, well, I guess you'd have to ask OMRI about that in particular, but not allowed for organic production according to OMRI. That surprises me, actually. It does meet the criteria for the National Organic Program, but maybe OMRI has made a decision based on some other impacts. It's possible. I guess I don't know the answer to that.
All right. And one I think is maybe more of a comment. So Signal says that having some of these labeling, it makes it really hard to refute the woo-woo claims of efficacy that you may see on a lot of homemade recipes and things that concoctions that people are making and presenting on the internet.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about that too.
Okay, so we'll hold on that.
About homemade concoctions. You're right. How do you refute those claims? If someone claims that it worked in their yard, that's great, but you might remind them that they shouldn't be making recommendations for things that have had no safety assessment whatsoever. That's one of the purposes for EPA registration of pesticides, is to get that assurance that someone has actually looked at how toxic those things are for a wide variety of things. For us, by different routes of exposure, and for bees, fish, birds, you name it, those things are required for registered pesticides. You know, when FIFRA first passed, FIFRA being the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, the first thing that was illegal in that statute was selling a useless pesticide. That was the kind of the point of that regulation to begin with, but that has really gone the other way, and they just kind of count on the market to take care of it. If there's a pesticide out there that doesn't work, people won't buy it. That's the idea. So sometimes the market works, sometimes not as well. Anything else?
So yeah, I think some of them come back to using the PNW handbooks,
Okay.
showing that some of them do designate that things can be used for organic systems, but you're always searching for the active ingredient, not necessarily the trade name on that. Yeah.
Okay, so it can answer the question about the active ingredient, but you always have to get that OMRI symbol on the product itself if you want to be sure.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's ask a poll question because I'm interested to learn from you. Which of these has worked best for you for aphid control? And we can't ask about everything, so I wanted to be specific about one thing.
Okay, I've got the poll launched, so we'll take about 20 seconds. In fact, Kaci, I was thinking about ladybugs. I actually grow hops. I do some home brewing, and I grow hops, and aphids are a problem on hops, and I've heard that
Yes.
ladybugs are, which always made me wonder, how are you supposed to put ladybugs? Like, I see myself out there throwing ladybugs on, and then they like fly off into, like, so there's no way to keep.
Yeah, that's possible. So we hear a lot about ladybugs, and you can even buy them. You can buy little packages of them at the nursery for sure. I've heard some mixed reports on that. In a closed system like a greenhouse, much more effective than they might be outdoors. Okay. I've heard some people say they actually harvest those ladybugs from a spot in California, and they immediately try to find that spot again. So they start flying, even if they're, in Michigan or wherever, they start flying for California where they're supposed to end up. So mixed results.
Okay. All righty. So I will share these results now.
Okay, this is mixed. Okay, in the chat box, I'm really curious about other. And while you're entering some things into the chat box, I'll tell you what my major professor at Michigan State did for aphids. He took his potted plants and put them in the back of his truck and drove around, hoping to knock them off in the wind. I'm sure his neighbors didn't appreciate that very much. Okay, any suggestions on what these other things might be? Brooke, you're muted.
Yeah, so it looks like most of them are not necessarily a pesticide-based control. So using other aspects of IPM, water, so water jets, squishing them, having sacrificial plants that all the aphids go to.
Yes. Yeah, having a nice aphid population in the garden somewhere is good for all your beneficials. It's like a buffet that never stops giving. Well, that's really neat. Thank you for sharing all that. Let's move on. I want to make sure we have time to cover everything and get more of your questions, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot when we come to the herbicide section. But first, let's look at a disease. I went through that same process using the PICL database to find things that were OMRI listed, registered in Oregon, intended for home users, and registered for black spot on ornamentals. I tried to find black spot on roses, but they didn't list rose specifically. So this would work on ornamentals, but you'd have to check the label to make sure. And these are the active ingredients that came up in that search. A soap salt, some of the same essential oils that we talked about before, the mineral oil and potassium carbonate acting similarly to kind of make a sheen on the top of the leaf or on the bottom of the leaf. Sulfur is probably the most common fungicide used in organic systems, and a couple of microbiological pesticides that you see there at the bottom. I need to mention specifically this product that had clove, sesame, and rosemary oils, had a signal word of warning and required eye protection and gloves. I just wanted to point that out. And sulfur. Let's spend just a second talking about sulfur, because this has been an issue that's been coming up more with increased greenhouse production in the state. There are several products that are OMRI listed with sulfur, very popular, very widely used. None of those products are registered to be burned. So if you've been reading on YouTube, watching on YouTube, or reading someone's recommendations that you can burn sulfur in a closed system and kill all the powdery mildew or whatever those things are, that's a label violation. And there has been no evaluation of how to keep workers safe, how long you should ventilate afterwards, what are the other concerns when you touch the surfaces that have interacted with that sulfur vapor, turns into sulfur dioxide, which is a registered pesticide and has some use limitations. So don't burn it until we have a registered product. There is one in Canada, so I think it might get to that point at some point in the future. Really, for black spot on ornamentals, resistant varieties are the best possible thing. And then there's other cultural controls that you can do that really help to bring the level of moisture down and keep it down, that are much more effective than these sprays. A fungus, a spore, has to sit on top of a leaf or on the bottom and actually get through that cuticle. So any of the products that you see here are trying to make a barrier so it can't get through that cuticle. Oftentimes they have to be applied over and over. So cultural things might be a better option. Moving forward, organic pesticides for rodents. There's really only 3 products available. They all have cholecalciferol as the active ingredient, which is also known as vitamin D3. Hopefully there's other methods for rodents in general. And these 3 products are only registered for roof rats, Norway rats, and house mice. And unlike other pesticides where you can use it for a product, you can use a product for a pest that's not listed. Usually that's not a problem. With rodenticides it is. It has to be species specific. So you couldn't use these vitamin D3 products for a gopher, for example. You'd have to do something else for that group. But there's also hope on the horizon. Watch this one. Just in the last 2 months, these 2 products have been registered by the EPA as rodenticides with carbon dioxide as the active ingredient. One of them is dry ice. Essentially, you would use dry ice to generate the carbon dioxide and fill a burrow. The other one actually just comes with CO2 in a canister. And back in graduate school, we used to use CO2 all the time as, to knock out pests and get them ready to pin on boards and that kind of thing. But now you can use it for rats in their burrows. These have not been evaluated by OMRI or anyone else to my knowledge. It's just something to watch for on the horizon. There was a lot of cheers, I think, when these products first came out, at least on the listservs that I watch. There are also some organic pesticides for slugs and snails. Iron phosphate is an alternative to metaldehyde that actually has some pretty good uses. Sodium chloride, you probably recognize that as table salt. I'm not sure how well that works. I looked for beer on the list because it seems so popular. I've done that in my garden as well. You put a little yogurt cup out with some beer and it is full of slugs in the morning, and they're not happy slugs. But I looked on the OMRI list for beer and it's not listed. So if someone can correct me and say maybe it's somehow in there and I missed it, do let me know. Now, a question for everyone. In your organic garden, what drives you to use pesticides most often? And this is a choose one type of question. Weeds, diseases, early season insects or late season insects, slugs and snails, rodents and other varmints, or other?
Okay, we'll take about 20 seconds.
Okay. For folks watching around the country, slugs and snails may not be as big a deal, but in the Northwest, all of our gardeners need to worry about slugs and snails.
I was going to say, I'm in North Carolina, and I can't remember the last time I've seen a snail.
Well, plant some lettuce in Oregon, and they'll show up. Mm-hmm.
Don't rub it in, Mark. Don't rub it in.
Hey, we've got plenty of other things that I'm sure y'all don't have. So. Right, we'll end that, and I'm sharing the results now.
Look at that. Yeah, slugs and snails, #1. That really surprises me. And that is definitely a Northwest result that we're seeing in that case. Yeah, zinc metal strips have been registered. They're minimum risk pesticides, but they don't count as organic or biopesticides. Some people say they've had good luck with a copper tubing that goes around the raised bed, but it has to be pretty wide and it doesn't work on everything. And it certainly doesn't work on any slugs that are already in the bed. So that's surprising. I'm going to move on to weeds and moss in the next slide. Some organic pesticides registered for weeds and or moss. This is kind of one of those mixed bags. I'm not sure how well any of these actually work I think mulches and other cultural controls that we could talk about are probably more effective for weeds and moss. This is a tough one. I've actually heard from folks, there are several limonene products that are registered for use on roofs. We also have a big problem with moss on our roofs and sidewalks, Mark, in the Northwest. And limonene, it may work for if you spray it every week for months. It can make a big dent, but it really is a softer product. Ammonium salts of fatty acids is a soapy thing. Potassium laurate, also pretty soapy. And the idea with those is that it can burn them, especially if you apply it to weeds when it's warm, when it's really hot, and they're respiring and they're trying to do water exchange, and you put soap in there, it just mucks up the works. Copper hydroxide and copper oxychloride and acetic acid or vinegar. I had to jump in and say, really? There was no corn gluten meal? Because that's the big one I've heard of. Corn gluten meal being a good, essentially works as a mulch. I've heard from people on the phone that talked about using corn gluten meal for weeds, and essentially you have to apply it so thick, like an inch thick, that it's essentially acting like a mulch. It's not doing anything to deter the weeds other than being a mulch, and there's probably other things that work better at being a mulch, because the corn gluten meal is so fine, anything that makes a hole in it or brushes it aside, and then weeds can penetrate through that barrier. I want to come back to acetic acid and pay some special attention to that one. Acetic acid is the active ingredient in vinegar, and it's the biggest thing I've seen in chat rooms and online and places. People call our center about it all the time. Can't I just spray my weeds with vinegar? And then it's like a non-toxic, non-chemical solution. First, it is a chemical. Second, dose makes the poison, right? So if you get too much of it, it can be a problem. But let's look into this a little further. I found 2 products that were in our Oregon database with vinegar for weeds. And here's a snapshot of the label. For use in organic gardening, has a signal word of danger. That's the highest level of toxicity for pesticides. When I dug into the label further, it says danger corrosive, causes irreversible eye damage. You have to wear protective eyewear, such as goggles or a face shield or safety glasses. Well, when people pull their vinegar out from under the sink and pull that out to use, they're probably not thinking about using a face shield or safety glasses, but it is pretty scary. Now, this one is 23% acetic acid. That's pretty high. For the kinds of vinegar that you might find in the grocery store, they range from about 5% acetic acid to about 20% acetic acid, so they're lower than this product, but the other one is very similar. This one is a ready to use, so you don't have to dilute it. It only has 8% acetic acid, but it had the same warnings on the label based on the acute toxicity to the eye. Danger corrosive. You will find a lot of things online about how to use vinegar and other things to make homemade weed killers. I only put this up to say, please don't buy into those ideas. When this happens and people mix up their own thing that might be, you know, mostly vinegar, a bunch of salt, maybe some soap, essential oils, they can combine to create other things. They're not reviewed by the EPA at all. No one's looking to see how toxic those things might be. And mixing them up at home means we're more likely to see them in a drink container or something that could cause a real poisoning problem. So I'm not going to linger on that slide any longer because it scares me. Let's not be doing that. Find registered pesticide products to when you need a pesticide. And then you just have the assurance that someone has looked to see how toxic it is, what kind of PPE should be required, personal protective equipment, and then you have some assurance based on that label that you're doing things in a way that minimizes the risk. So those are some of my image credits, and with that, I want to take your questions and hear from you for the remainder of the time.
All right, Kaci, so we've got a couple of questions that came in. A few of them are on weeds, and then there's a couple of questions on the back to the rodenticides and back to fungicides too. So I'll work my way backwards with the questions.
Okay.
So Yvonne wants to know about if the vinegar would hurt the microorganisms in the soil. So all these homemade concoctions, what does that do to the rest of the organisms?
That's a great question. Sure, of course it's going to affect the microorganisms in the soil. Adding something like that is highly acidic. It's acetic acid. So it can change the pH, which could change which microbes are happy there. It could impact the mycorrhizae that are growing in your rich organic soil. Yeah, it could absolutely have an effect, and it especially could have an effect if it's one of those crazy concoctions that includes a bunch of salt.
All right. So one question, and I've actually gotten this one a lot. Some people are using bleach to control weeds, just your household Clorox bleach. So yeah. And then there's two questions about using boiling water, maybe not necessarily considered a pesticide, but that may.
Okay, with bleach, I don't know if it works for one thing, but many bleach products are actually labeled pesticides because they kill a pest. They kill the germs in your sink or on your toilet seat. And if you are using one that's a registered pesticide, you're not allowed to pour it in your yard. That's not a labeled use. But there are products that are more so, they're not labeled as pesticides, they're just sold as cleaners, and it wouldn't be illegal, but I wouldn't know how to caution someone about what kind of personal protective equipment or plant back restrictions. There's so many unknowns about it. That person would have to be willing to take on all those risks. It would be, user beware. And as far as boiling water, I have heard that it can be very effective, but those weeds do tend to come back, but it's very hard to apply boiling water in a way that is low risk, especially in a scenario where there could be splashing and you have to be right there to apply it. And the further you get it from yourself, the more it's cooling off on the way to getting there. So I'm uncomfortable recommending it because of potential dangers. But I have heard from some individuals that it has worked.
Someone would like to know about using baking soda. So your household, there are a lot of household remedies, and we get all of these questions as master gardeners at the desk. What can I use? So someone wants to know about baking soda use against weeds for weed control.
Okay. Well, I'm not aware of any products that have been evaluated for that purpose. Now, I think commonly the baking soda is mixed with something. It might be mixed with water. It might be mixed with other things like vinegar or salt. Any one of those mixtures could behave differently, and I'm really not comfortable recommending something that has never been evaluated for its safety in that respect. What it's doing to the soil microbe community, what it's doing to other beneficials, they're just unknowns. And with a registered pesticide product, we have those things figured out, and the information is on the label. So that is a lower risk approach, no matter what.
All right. Let me go back to the rodenticide. So you had a vitamin, refresh my memory, vitamin product.
Vitamin D3.
Yeah, so Cheryl wants to know if that rat has been killed by that compound and then it's eaten by a predator, like a cat. Will the cat be affected? Is this something that maybe we need to read the label to find some of these details, or how would they?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, vitamin D3 doesn't work the same way as many of the anticoagulant rodenticides that actually accumulate, and they can kill at such low doses that there's very often leftover pesticide in the gut of the dead rat that can go to the cat. Vitamin D3 doesn't work in that same way. It has a lower risk, but still a risk exists for secondary poisoning, and that goes for birds of prey that might be looking for those kind of rats in addition to your cats. So do read the label and watch for carcasses. If you're using a product like that in your garden, hopefully you'll see some and you can remove them and put them in the garbage where predators won't come across them.
Jean would like to know about the use of caffeine as an insecticide or for slug or snail control. Is there any?
Okay. So there is one registered pesticide with caffeine as the active ingredient, but you'll never guess what pest it's for. Snakes. And it's only registered in the state of Hawaii, so don't get any ideas. It was for an invasive snake in Hawaii that they have used caffeine for. But it depends on the type of, well, let's picture what you're talking about here, like taking caffeine pills and grinding them up, or coffee, tea, things that contain caffeine. Each of those is a different chemical concoction. So the unknowns are just very highly variable. But I'm picking up that there is a big desire to use familiar things. If it's familiar, like caffeine or baking soda, then it must be lower in toxicity. That's not necessarily the case. So caffeine is definitely a toxin, and at high enough doses, it can really hurt people and animals. So without having a product that's registered that has use directions that have been evaluated, and certainly what about the residue that might end up on your plants, and how that's going to affect things. Just with those unknowns, I'd be very uncomfortable recommending that. And I'm not even sure it would work.
There's quite a few questions on here that are asking for specifics that maybe you might not be familiar with, Kaci, and so this might be something that we might have to answer offline, just asking for specific management of specific diseases and insects. So I'm not sure how comfortable you are answering some of those on, managing powdery mildew and black spot and that sort of thing. So we might hold those questions maybe for another session unless you're comfortable with that.
Well, on those specifics, let me come back to, remember, we can search for pesticide products that are registered for those uses. It doesn't necessarily mean they work very, very well. Resistant varieties are really the best for things like black spot, powdery mildew, moisture management, airflow management. Those are all probably more effective than any product I could tell you. But another thing with those diseases is, remember we talked about the leaf cuticle. Maintaining a barrier is really difficult when you've got the weather, the elements out there. So very often products have to be applied over and over if you're relying on pesticide products for disease control. So that just means more exposure for you, more exposure for the environment on those, whether they're organic or not. So those resistant varieties, moisture management techniques are probably more effective than pesticides. But telling you how to search for registered products doesn't tell you what's effective, and that's a piece where I can't help. I don't know. Especially on a national basis, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the Master Gardener would have to dig in a little bit deeper into some of the research and start digging into there.
Yeah, and talking to each other, I'm sure like there's people watching today who have great ideas and thoughts to share.
So Pammy would like to know if the databases that you've mentioned, do you think that they're maybe more of a useful reference for chemical recommendations versus probably the PNWs? Those are something that, at least in Oregon, we train our Master Gardeners on, or are they something that get used together?
So a better database for finding products to recommend?
That's what it sounds like.
Okay, so the PICOL database that we went over today is one option. There's another that, everybody likes different things in their databases, so I'll mention this other one is at the National Pesticide Information Center. And on that site, I can read it off to you. It's npic.orst.edu/ all caps NPRO, NPRO. And that database can also be searched by crop, by pest, by signal word. It does not include whether or not something is organically grown. Organic, approved by OMRI for organic production. So that makes it tougher, but it can help find more products that are registered for those uses. That is a national database rather than an Oregon specific database. So that's another one to remember. UC Davis has a lot of great resources as well for pest management and often list a lot of great options, including all the cultural and biological and mechanical options for pests. Those are fantastic. The NPIC website has several IPM topics. They're not going to recommend a specific pesticide, but it's getting harder and harder to find someone who will recommend a specific pesticide for all the reasons we've talked about. Resistance is local. Pest populations are local. It's very hard to be able to make any promises about pests that evolved so quickly.
And I did put that link in the chat box if you go down to that chat screen.
Thank you.
Let me see what else.
And remember the OMRI search as well. If you go to the OMRI website and search for products that are allowed to be used in organic agriculture, that 195 pager will come up, but also they have a search feature, so you can put in like what pests you're struggling with or what crop you have.
Sherry would just like you to give us maybe a summary of the benefits of choosing organic pesticides.
Okay. Customers, I think that's a big one. Customer confidence. If you're selling your products or if you're giving your products to friends and family and you just feel better about it, it's a widely understood idea. More than biopesticides or minimum risk or any of those other ideas, organic is well understood and well known. They tend to break down faster. They tend to have fewer non-target impacts, partly because they break down faster and partly because they're more pest specific, or they can be more pest specific. Those non-toxic modes of action for all the plant oils and things like that, attracting and repelling, are softer and less impactful on pollinators because they're not eating that treated material. There's quite a few reasons to choose organic. Thanks for asking.
Just peeking through here. So let's see, some folks are just saying they have other ways of killing weeds in paths. They maybe use steamers or those flame torches, so it's a non-pesticide option. Are you familiar enough about moss and how moss grows? Or maybe we need another webinar just on moss for our Oregon, Washington folks.
I think that would be helpful. One of the jobs I do for Oregon State is that I monitor I evaluate products for use in schools. There's a school IPM law in Oregon, and products have to meet certain criteria. Moss is the hardest thing because all the zinc products that we might like to use for moss are a signal word of danger, and that means they're not allowed for use in schools. Limonene is something people have tried. It's a bugaboo, moss especially. I think we need a little more expertise on moss to talk about that better. Scrubbing. There's always scrubbing.
We'll get that in the next series. We're almost at time. Don has a comment on, or if you can comment on the use of the flammable sulfur, but for gopher eradication. Are there any thoughts on that? I know it's really specific. Some of these questions are pretty specific. We might need to find a wildlife management expert to help us.
And that I can clearly say don't do that, because the rodent burrow comes out in places you may not be aware that there was a run that actually came up in your neighbor's yard. And when you're burning sulfur, it creates sulfur dioxide that might be coming out in that unknown space. And how could you protect your neighbors without being able to tell them? And sulfur dioxide is not something you should be inhaling on a regular basis. There are rules for that, and the sulfur dioxide products that they're used in wineries, for example, there's specific instructions on how to protect workers from that sulfur dioxide gas. So without being able to know where that's going to go, boy, the risks are high. Plus, it's illegal. Boy, this has been a really robust conversation. I'm very happy. I'm very excited that all y'all showed up with your questions and your ideas. And I also picked up even more. There is a lot of demand for those familiar ideas. Like, if I can just grab something in the kitchen and use that for pests, that's what people want to do, whether it's super toxic or not. But it's interesting to know how deep that runs.
And again, I'll put a link again in chat to the Learn site. If you want to rewatch this webinar, or feel free to share it with others who might not have been able to attend, we'll have a link to the video at that Learn site within a few days.
We also have a survey link that will be coming out. So I popped it into the chat box. And we'll also put that link on the Learn site, and you may get an email about it, but we definitely would like to hear your feedback. And there's a space in there too to hear about other topics that you might be interested in. So I know a lot of things came up that we couldn't necessarily address today, but it sounds like we're ready to go on the next series of topics there.
Yes.
So Kaci, do you have the slide with the next week's talk?
I do.
Have any last words of wisdom for us before we close out for the afternoon?
More so a word of thanks. Thanks for everything you do, Master Gardeners. You're such an important service to the community, and it's just wonderful. Keep up the great work.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaci. Tune in next week if you're interested in learning about brown marmorated stink bugs, controlling them with biological controls. Should be a really interesting talk. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.